Here in Germany, we have a show on private TV where the two presenters can win airtime in which they can do whatever they want. And this time they have chosen a topic that's also interesting for this channel. As part of their hard-earned 50 minutes of live airtime the day before, Joko Winterscheidt and Klaas Heufer-Umlauf wanted to know from experts what would happen if there were no longer a united Europe from tomorrow. And there was some artificial intelligence provided dystopian images to accompany the horror scenarios of the interviewees. Joko Winterscheidt and Klaas Heufer-Umlauf were allowed to redeem their 15-minute broadcast voucher after their victory in their show Joko and Klaas against Pro7, that's the station, last week. And we're talking about the European Union today, said Heufer-Umlauf at the beginning. And according to colleague Winterscheidt, this is currently being questioned a lot. And he also said, some people want self-sufficient states, their own currency, closed borders, or isolation from the globalized world economy. And against this background, the two Pro7 figureheads asked proven experts what would actually happen if the EU were to collapse overnight. We then took their statements and had them illustrated by an AI, which illustrated them very realistically, but also very drastically in some cases. But that could happen if we don't take care of it, warned Heufer-Umlauf. First, Brexit was discussed. Nikolai von Ondarza, head of the EU-Europe Research Group at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin, I mentioned him earlier on this channel, he confirmed that one of the main goals of Brexit, limiting migration, has simply not been achieved. On the contrary, the number of refugees to Great Britain has risen massively because it is much more difficult to work together with France and other EU states, he said. And Andrew Lee, professor of economics at the Baden-Württemberg Cooperative State University in Karlsruhe, then outlined what would happen in the very first phase after the EU collapsed. Within minutes, there would be chaos on the financial markets. Speculators would immediately withdraw their money from comparatively unstable countries such as Cyprus, Greece, and Portugal. Of course, all borders would also be closed, which would cause enormous uncertainty for the approximately 25 million people in Europe who live in border regions and perhaps work or have families in the neighboring country. The fact that I, as a European, can live and work anywhere in Europe without major bureaucratic problems would change massively. That was said by Jana Puljerin, the head of the European Council on Foreign Relations Berlin, given a brief outlook while the images showed chaos at airports and refugees in tents. And Daniel Dettling, the political scientist and director of the Institute for Future Studies in Berlin, also painted a scenario that was anything but pleasant. There will certainly be massive military buildup at the borders. The European external border will become an internal border again, and every country will try to protect its own borders. This is very expensive and will lead to less and less exchange between people and goods. And the result would be delivery bottlenecks and delivery failures. Fresh food in supermarkets, for example, could become scarce in an instant. And a collapse of the EU would also be an extreme blow for larger industries such as the automotive industry. Just-in-time production, that means the very rapid delivery of components from neighboring European countries, would collapse. That was explained by Lee, while idle and abandoned factories flickered across the screen there. And of course the euro would also be at an end, which would mean that 20 countries would have to introduce new currencies. Reintroducing the Deutschmark would cause enormous problems for Germany as an export country. And Lee says about this, if there were to be an appreciation pressure of, say, 30 euros, well, export goods such as cars, machines, chemical or pharmaceutical programs would become more expensive in foreign currency overnight, and sales and profits would collapse. Around 1 in 4 jobs in Germany depends on exports. As part of the rationalization, companies would of course also have to cut wages and lay off employees, which would probably lead to a doubling of the unemployment rate within a few years. And there would also be numerous company closures and the consequences for society as a whole, such as less prosperity in society and less budget revenue, and that would cause, especially for Germany, great distress. In addition, a decline in the EU would make it easy for powers such as China and Russia to exert influence. Germany and all other EU states are ultimately economic dwarfs compared to the USA or China alone. And it will be very difficult to renegotiate trade relations that reflect our interests because we are simply economically irrelevant, revealed Lynn Selle, president of the European Movement Germany, who would also be very concerned about the lack of EU funds after 1 to 2 years at the latest. That would mean, for example, that agricultural aid would be stopped, which would probably also lead to massive protests by farmers. And Pulierin also struck a similar note when she said the loss of structural funds from the European Union would lead to impoverishment, particularly in structurally weak areas. There would no longer be any infrastructure available, and the gap between town and country would become much greater in areas where we already have problems today, with doctors or pharmacies, for example. And all of this would be particularly fatal for the health system, which is already dependent on immigration. There will then be no more immigration into those systems, and older people and those in need of care in particular will no longer be cared for, which means that mortality among them will increase. And those are images that are difficult to bear. That was explained by Detling while the report showed desperate and homeless people in need of care. The current environmental standards would also then be over. States would have to organize regulations on how toxic waste should be disposed or how wastewater should be handled individually. And environmental pollution or damage across borders could hardly be prevented in this way. And Detling says, but what worries me the most is the uncertainty. When people are uncertain, we saw that at the beginning of the corona pandemic, they become susceptible to populism, simple answers, nationalism and mistrust. And parties that promote simple and quick solution would then have the upper hand again. They would emphasize the differences between countries much more than the similarities, said Pulierin. And according to her, wars between European states could then no longer be ruled out. How livable would such a Europe still be? The EU shapes so many things in our lives, it doesn't do everything right, but in many things it brings more diversity and cooperation, was said by Nikolai von Onderza at the end of the expert interviews. And finally, the two people responsible for the program spoke again. We don't need people who actually just want to be elected to the European Parliament in order to destroy it from within and ruin our shared vision, said Klaas Heufer-Umlauf. And Joko Winterscheidt said, it doesn't have to happen like this, and it's up to us to make sure it doesn't. And there are European elections on June 9th, and we should all go. With that point, I definitely can agree with the two. But of course, I have to say what they've shown there was extremely hypothetical. And it just highlighted something that would not happen like this. The collapse would not be from one day to another. I don't see a collapse anyway in the future. But Brexit has shown us that some of these things that Onderza and others have said are quite likely, not in the severity they've shown in that show, but on the slower path, exactly things like this happened with Brexit, and it wouldn't be as drastic as they painted the picture now, because even if the EU were dissolved, it wouldn't happen like this. No, but a lot of this was shown by Brexit, and that's also the reason why, seriously, no party, except one couple of fools here in Germany, is anywhere talking about leaving the EU anymore. Because Brexit had one big advantage: to stop everyone else in the EU to think about leaving the EU. But if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.